Howdy, partners. Welcome back to another episode of the Staying In podcast. I wanted to, first of all, thank everyone for all the questions and inquiries from the last episode. I was really happy with seeing that there were so many people who seemed to find some value in it or interested in knowing more. And if you're one of those people, I made a Staying In podcast subreddit that I'll link in the description, and we also have a little Discord going. So if you'd like to join that and talk about some of this stuff, you're welcome to go check it out there. So I thought in this one, what I would do is introduce the sort of concept of what's called self-inquiry that I alluded to in the last episode, which is really similar in theme to something like talk therapy, but it can go much deeper to the real roots of the underlying structure that I've been talking about. And so I wanted to start by introducing that and then maybe go into a bit of Q&A, because there's been a lot of people, whether it's on Reddit or the YouTube comments, who've asked lots of questions. And I thought it might be just most sensible to respond to some of those and see where the conversation goes from there for future episodes. So let's start with self-inquiry. So the real reason why self-inquiry, and it also relates to something like talk therapy, is valuable is because really what we're inquiring into is our own subjective beliefs about who we are, what the world is, and how we experience our day-to-day lives. And the reason why this is such an obscure topic usually, and even talk therapy, I think, really just scratches the surface. It doesn't get down to any super important roots. Is because we're not used to at all using thinking for subjective inquiry. What we're used to all the time is, for example, learning a new skill or learning a new subject, and then we get tested on it. And whether that's an actual quiz like in school, or it's like you get an assignment at work, or you go and try to accomplish something. So you just need to have sufficient knowledge to quote unquote get the right answer. This is a completely different thing. Self-inquiry is actually asking yourself a question, not knowing what the answer is and not knowing what you think about it, and discovering what it is that you believe or think about yourself. The reason this is important is because ultimately at the end of the road, there's that sort of click moment that I described, where there's genuinely a transformative experience when you realize, oh shit, I was doing this thing my whole life, and what was I thinking? Holy shit, you don't need to do that. That type of phenomena. At a smaller scale, this is one of the reasons why something like talk therapy is so helpful, is because, again, at a much lower level, as you start talking about what you believe, say, for example, if you're socially anxious, if you start by saying, oh, I don't really know why I'm socially anxious. Most people don't do that. Most people assume they know, but they actually don't. And this is the reason why when you have a therapist or something asking you questions, you start talking about different circumstances and you suddenly realize something about yourself that you didn't know before, or you didn't understand before, rather. But again, we're trying to go right down to the root. So the way that this works, and I want to emphasize, is the hardest part of self-inquiry is, first of all, you have to do all the work, in the sense that the only person who is going to be able to discover the answers is you, because what you're inquiring into is your own subjective thoughts and beliefs. An example would be if I gave you 10 different ice cream flavors. As you tried each one, you would be able to create your own ranking of which one you like the most and which one you like the least. There's no actual correct answer. And so what you're trying to do is understand your own subjective relationship, in that instance, to the to taste. In this example, what we're doing is not necessarily analyzing, but observing our own thoughts and beliefs about ourselves. So typically the process is, if you start with the question like, who am I? I think it's, or what am I? What we have to do right away is not try to get carried away and say, oh my God, I'm a soul in a body. Where did I come from? When the Bible is, or like, a religious take, or you say, oh no, well, it's all material. So I came from DNA and I came from matter. And it's like, no. Like, you're not going into some imaginary belief. This is, again, externalizing and trying to find an objective answer that you're going to say, yep, that's it. You have to go the opposite direction, which is saying, for example, in the context of who you think you are, you start off by saying, I don't know what I am. I haven't really figured it out. But instead of trying to find the answer, what you do is you check what you currently believe. And so what you do is you either write it down, you can think in your own head, you can talk out loud, you can do a little podcast just for yourself, that type of thing. But you need to, in some way, produce the thought in order to observe in your own experience what it is that you, for example, think you are. And again, I want to emphasize, you have to do this. It sounds like I'm like, okay, well, when is he going to tell me how to do it? It's like, no, you have to do the inquiry. The reason this is so challenging is because we never think this way typically. And metaphorically, the idea is, imagine if you start navigating your thoughts, it seems like an overwhelming burden, but it's really similar to having, say, 1,000 pieces of string. And then as you start looking at them, you realize, a bunch of these can tie together. So you go from 1,000 pieces of string to, say, 100, twines. And then you go from 100 twines, I guess, to 10 braids. And then from 10 braids, eventually you end up with 2 ropes. And once you get it down all the way to see the very structures that, basically that are in your conscious experience, you suddenly realize, wait a minute, these 2 structures, I can't put them together into one. There must be some fundamental misunderstanding. And from there can be, some sort of insight or transformative experience that then unifies those or causes you to see the error in your own understanding of one of those things. So just to give a small example of, again, a subjective inquiry and the way that you have to approach this is, imagine, for example, you hate a certain politician. I think we can all imagine a certain politician that we might hate or dislike or whatever it might be. But when I say hate, I mean, for example, when you read opinions about them online that contradict your own beliefs, you get mad. You actually emotionally get mad. And this is your beliefs conflicting with some external phenomena. Now, most people, for example, I'll just use the name, something like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. A lot of people have immensely strong emotions towards both of these figures that result in uncontrollable rage, no matter what they see them doing or that happens to them or whenever they read an opinion, or even the idea of, they hear someone say, oh, I actually like him, and, it infuriates them, for example. And if you were to ask these people, oh, why don't you like this person? They basically have an understanding that's about 3 sentences deep. It's like, well, they're just such an idiot. They say this, but they never do it. And it's just like, it's a very shallow understanding. So if you were to take a subjective inquiry into that, you start off by saying something like, damn, I really hate Donald Trump. When anyone brings him up, I just get infuriated and it just makes me so mad. And then you say, okay, well, let me figure out why. And you're going to start off by saying, well, I actually don't know why I hate this person so much. Well, let me see what I think. And then you just start talking, or you start writing, or you start thinking, and you'll go through a process like, well, I really don't like his attitude. And it's like, okay, well, what do you think his attitude is? Well, I think his attitude is one where he says things that tricks people into thinking that he's going to help them, but really he's just out there to help himself. And it's like, okay, well, why is it that you don't like that? Why is that something that's bad? And you look at again, you're talking to yourself hypothetically in this example, and you say, well, he's misleading people. And it's like, well, why don't you like people being misled? What's wrong with that? And then as you start going through this, you're going to start to realize certain beliefs that you have. For example, you might have, you'll say, oh, these people are too stupid, to think for themselves, but not me. I can think for myself. And then you start realizing things like, oh, I think that I'm smarter than other people. And then as you start going through these things, you realize, oh, one of the reasons I don't like this person is actually my own internal smugness and belief that I'm superior to other people. And as you go through these things, all of a sudden, sometimes the lights start turning on, and again, these individual threads start combining. But I really want to emphasize, you have to do the process. And again, I don't have an opinion on Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I just use that as an example because it's usually politics are so emotionally charged. So that I wanted to just give as a bit of an introduction to the concept. And now I was hoping I could probably answer a few questions that a lot of people wrote in the subreddit and on Discord, and I'll just I'll go to that. So one of the primary things that I think a lot of people sort of latched onto in the last podcast was the idea of not being able to think about yourself, because obviously, our whole lives we constantly think about ourselves, and so the idea that, oh, you can't actually do that is like suddenly jarring. But I think the thing that's really interesting to note about that, for example, is we all know that there's something a little off with the way that we think about ourselves normally, in the sense that when you remember doing something embarrassing, 10 years ago, you kind of relive the experience emotionally and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Why do I do that? It doesn't really make sense. But other times you think like, oh man, I have a big date coming up, and you imagine like, oh, what if like we walk into the bar and I trip over, or we're talking and I like spill the beer on her, and then, oh my God, that'd be so bad. And you're like, oh, well, I'm pretty anxious about that. But I mean, that does make sense because I'm trying to avoid that happening. So it's good that I'm thinking it. So it's like, one situation you kind of realize, oh, that's irrational. The other one you realize, oh no, maybe that is rational. I don't know, but we're not really sure. So again, self-inquiry ultimately resolves that type of confusion, or that, like, oh, why is it like that? Which is why I think it's so important. But again, you have to kind of go through that process. But anyway, going back to the main point, which was a lot of people sort of latched onto the idea of, oh, you can't really think about yourself. And so we have this question, which I think kind of touches on that concept, and I'm hoping I can kind of clarify it. So the question is, I'm having a hard time with the notion of self you talk about. I think the way people generally understand the concept of self is that it's just a shorthand for things you do, things you like, the way you look, etc. Of course, those are all things about yourself, not the entity yourself, but I don't think that matters. We use imagination as a tool to abstract all sorts of things. Why can't it also be used as a tool to understand the way you operate in the world? If I know I have a history of messing up in social situations, saying bad jokes, being awkward, why is it incorrect to have social anxiety? Are you rejecting the idea of imagination as a valid tool? So I think this is a really good question, because the main point and the main thing that I really want to get at is right between those two paragraphs. So the first thing I want to say is, no, I'm not rejecting imagination or thinking as a valid tool. It's pretty much the most useful tool and the defining feature of what human beings are fundamentally. I think it's really, really useful. But what I want to emphasize here is, when this person says, oh, I think the way that people generally understand the concept of self is like things about yourself, like how tall am I, how attractive am I, how intelligent am I, all that type of stuff. There's nothing wrong with thinking those things or, trying to figure those things out, because they can be useful for your day-to-day operation. Nothing wrong with thinking, air quotes, about yourself in terms of like how you're going to go operate in the world. But I think the important part is right when we get to the second paragraph, because I think it shows the fundamental misunderstanding that causes this sort of emotional relationship to the imagination of yourself in the first place, which is when they say, if I know I have a history of messing up in social situations, saying bad jokes, being awkward, why is it incorrect to have social anxiety? So I think this is really important, because I could pretty much describe myself with all of those thoughts. That's pretty much the same thing that I do all the time. But this is the part where there's the confusion. I'll read it one more time. If I know I have a history of messing up in social situations, saying bad jokes, being awkward, why is it incorrect to have social anxiety? The actual question is, I, for example, think the same thing about myself, but I no longer experience pretty much any social anxiety. Well, I just don't experience social anxiety because it's related to this underlying root structure that is realized to be operating in error. But say, for example, you have these thoughts, I have the same thoughts. The question is not why is it incorrect to have social anxiety? The question is, why do you have the social anxiety? And the reason fundamentally is what causes social anxiety is the belief that there is danger or some type of threat in socializing. So say, for example, when they say saying bad jokes, that's viewed as, for example, oh, I'm going to say something funny, and then you go for it and no one laughs. And then you feel really bad. You're like, oh, fuck, oh, shit. Like, oh, that was so bad. And then, like, say, same with being awkward. It's like, oh, if I'm awkward, then that's bad. There's a fear of fucking something up and either ruining your reputation or being embarrassed or losing social capital or whatever it is. And that's what causes the social anxiety, because you believe something bad might happen to you. And so the question, which again goes back to self-inquiry, is what is the you that you're frightened of something bad happening to? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the reason social anxiety as an example can completely come to an end is because the entity that you're actually concerned about is what I've described before as your self-image, your self-knowledge. It's the imagination of yourself that you're, or what people call an ego, for example. It's the imagination of yourself that you're worried is going to be hurt or threatened by this. I'll give you an example. I think this is a pretty good way of understanding it. Let's imagine that you have a bit of an idea that you're pretty smart. And so you're like, yeah, I'm pretty smart. I probably have an IQ of like 130. So you have a bit of it. That's what you think about yourself. Now, imagine, for example, you're doing a psychology course in university, and they go and say, okay, well, just for the heck of it, we're going to do like a real IQ test. Everyone's going to do one just so we can see what the process is like, because you might have to administer it to someone else for, therapeutic reasons or whatever. And so, this person's really excited because they're like, oh, I'm so smart. I'm going to probably be the smartest person in here. And so then they go and do the IQ test, and all of a sudden, it wasn't what they expected. It's not like those little Facebook quizzes, that's like, oh, which is the next in the sequence. It's actually a larger, battery of tests. And for example, they're getting a bit nervous now. They're like, oh, this is what I thought it was. And say they get their IQ test result back, and their IQ is 95. And all of a sudden, they're just devastated. They're like, oh, what? No, like, what the fuck? And so all of a sudden, they had a belief that they were very intelligent. And then all of a sudden, they have new information that they believe in, where they're just like, oh my God, I'm actually way dumber than I thought. And this is really devastating for them. All of a sudden, the things they thought they were going to do in the future, how they thought they were better than everyone, how their intelligence would lead to all sorts of things in their life, all of a sudden that rug has been pulled out from under them, and they're really devastated. Now, this is an example of this imaginary self being hurt. The reason this person is upset is because who they think they are was just hurt. And because in reality, like say, from my perspective, and this is actually the truth, I think this should be very observable, but it's not how we react, is your intelligence hasn't actually changed. The moment before you got the test results and the moment afterwards, your intelligence never changed, but your beliefs about how intelligent you were did. And so what that has done is who you think you are, your self-knowledge, has changed. And it's gone from something that you believed was good and that you wanted into something that you didn't want, and that's a devastating experience. And again, I want to emphasize, it's very obvious that your actual intelligence has never changed. Well, I mean, maybe since you were a kid or something, but in that moment, before and after the test, your actual intelligence doesn't change. In the same way that if you think you're pretty attractive, and then, like a car full of teenage girls goes by and they all yell out like, you're ugly. All of a sudden you're like, oh, what? I'm ugly. And all of a sudden your beliefs about yourself change, and that causes distress. Even though, again, you are always exactly as attractive as you are, it doesn't matter what you think about yourself. And so if we go back to the social anxiety example, the reason you experience social anxiety is because there is a belief that who you are is is going to be threatened by potentially acting awkward or getting rejected or saying a bad joke. But if you really examine the entity, again, through the process that I described earlier as self-inquiry, you'll realize that the entity you're actually frightened of is your own beliefs changing, in the sense that what you're frightened of is one thought is going to be attacked by another thought, and the threat in relationship between these two things is what's causing fear. The reason there's fear is because you think that who you are is in part an object of thought. And so again, this is exactly the way that nightmares operate, which is the belief that you exist in thought. And then if you believe that you can turn yourself into an object of thought, think about yourself, that means that you kind of exist in thought, so to speak. And that means another thought, or whatever you think is in another thought, can come and threaten you, which is what causes social anxiety. It's what causes, say, anger at hearing about what a dumb politician did. It causes frustration and getting upset when someone insults you. It also causes a sort of rush and sort of like a, oh, really? Like, if you get flattered, for example, these are all examples of a distortion that's created by self-knowledge, the structure of self-knowledge, self-image, ego, whatever you want to call it. Again, I just want to emphasize that similar to how intelligent you are, it does not matter how intelligent you think you are. You are always exactly as intelligent as you are. Trying to figure it out with your own knowledge actually creates a distortion, and the belief that your intelligence is defined by an IQ score is not that it's not correlated. I understand that it's like saying, no, I'm only as tall as I think. No, you're exactly as tall as you are. But all of a sudden, if you measure it and it says, "Oh, you're 5'5," and you're like, "No, I'm not. I'm 5'8." It's like it doesn't matter what you believe yourself to be. You're always exactly what you are. If that makes any sense. So the change in psychological processing that I've described in the sort of click moment is a realization. There is no value to having self-knowledge. Not just no value, but there is no entity that you can think about that is yourself, because in essence, it is the entity. It's like you can't taste your own tongue. You can't, see your own eyes. You can't think about your own thoughts. You can't think about yourself. It's always externally oriented. And so I hope that kind of answers that to some degree. And we'll go to the next question. Actually, I changed my mind very quickly. I was just gonna show you a brilliant picture that I drew to help sort of illustrate the automatic change in sort of mental processing that I talked about last time, and what really sort of what is the experiential difference after you have this sort of click or realization of that, if that makes any sense. And so here's the drawing. Okay, so that's me, hypothetically. This is an example of how I remember, I think this is pretty much how everyone thinks, but it doesn't have to be the way that you think, because it's based on a misunderstanding. But I also want to emphasize that at first glance, this might not make a lot of sense, because whenever we think about ourselves, we don't really break it into two steps. We don't think oh, I'm imagining myself, and then I'm imagining something happening to myself. It's usually just in one step, but this is actually what's happening. And if you look really closely in your own experience, this is what you're doing. So say, for example, you have me, and then what happens is you abstract yourself into a self-image. So a self-image is just your imagined self. But so you abstract yourself. So you say, me, I abstract myself, and then you imagine, for example, a bad event occurs to that imagined self. But it's perceived as an imaginary event, but it could be something that happens to the real you in the future. But the relationship is you abstract yourself, then imagine something, say bad, for example, happening to you. And I think this is a good follow-up for the social anxiety example, because here, obviously, you've become part of the meme world, and you've obviously done something very embarrassing at this frat party. So just to read and then, for example, this causes you to think, when you have this relationship, oh God, that would be bad. How do I avoid being socially embarrassed? And this results in avoidant behavior, anxiety, and your thinking continues endlessly trying to resolve the imagined problem. But the resolution is impossible, because the continued operation of imagination is itself inventing the problem. So this is the reason why, if you're not doing anything, you're pretty much always thinking about something. It's because what you're really doing is you're trying to think about yourself. You're trying to think about your self-image. But the problem is your self-image and the imagination of yourself, that is the entity. It's like an Ouroboros or a dog chasing its own tail. The reason you can't stop thinking is fundamentally because you can't actually think about yourself. The continuation of thought is what you think is yourself. That I know that's a bit obscure, but say, for example, I think most people can kind of relate to this sort of scenario. Now, I want to show you the way that you perceive thinking. Say, hopefully at the end of Self-Enquiry, it'll be the same automatic perception that you have. But this is how it operates. It can operate differently in the same circumstance. So here's me. And so it's basically the same thing, but it's a direct relationship to thought, where there's me and what I'm thinking. And I know on the surface this doesn't seem very different, but I think the description will kind of, makes you sort of think that's interesting. So for example, if you don't have a self-image, as in you realize it's not possible to turn yourself into an object of thought and think about yourself, automatically the way that thinking occurs is again, it's like a cartoon cloud, just me and what I'm thinking. And so then, for example, this causes you to think, when you're experiencing this, it just causes you to think, I am imagining what it might look like if I embarrass myself in front of some girls. There is no interpreted meaning, and thinking then stops. and there's no emotional relationship to that imagination. And the reason why, fundamentally, because again, this entire, the entire point of what I'm trying to describe is it's all automatic, and it's a result of a realization of an error. For example, your self-image in the first example is a mistake. It's not actually there in the sense that you think it's there, and that's why you keep trying to think about it, but you can't ever reach a conclusion because it's not. It's a misunderstanding of how you think about yourself and what that entity is. So when, for example, I say there is no interpreted meaning and then thinking stops, I think this is probably the most surprising part if I were to read this in the past. And one of the people commented on this on the subreddit. I was looking for some feedback of how it kind of resonated with people. And the person said, oh, I kind of get what you're saying, but why is there no interpretation? And I think that's a great question, because the answer to the question is to flip it around the other way. Why do you think something and then interpret it? Why is it normal, for example, if you were to imagine, this picture of all these girls looking backwards at you, and you just did something awkward? Why do you then interpret that? Why do you say, oh, this picture is something bad that might happen to me in the future? Why did you do that? Why did you interpret the image? In the same sense that another way of sort of framing this entire concept that I'm trying to communicate is really the realization that, say, for example, thinking is just another sensory perception that happens automatically to you. The same as tasting something, the same as seeing something, the same as touching something. It's an automatic sensory experience that occurs to you just in the instant, and it just operates as it is. The reason this is important is because if you, for example, are watching a sunset, you don't interpret it. I mean, you could. I think a lot of people do have a habit of sort of interpreting things. But say, for example, if you're looking at a sunset or you see a nice flower, you just look at it, and there it is. You don't suddenly say, you don't sort of argue with what you're experiencing. You're just like, well, what's happening? It's like, I'm looking at the sunset, and that's all. That's it. I'm looking at the sunset. It's like when you're watching a movie, you're just like, I'm watching the movie. And you don't know what's going to happen. You just let the stimulus occur to your eyes because you know it's something out in the real world that you're looking at. Same thing with your eating an ice cream. If you eat, say your favorite ice cream is like mint chocolate chip, and you're eating that, you're like, this is very tasty. You don't start saying like, why is it? What am I tasting this wrong? This tastes really good, but what if I'm not correct? What if this is actually the worst? What if this is poison? What if you don't think that? You're just like, yum. There's no thinking related to it. It doesn't have to be. You just allow the sensory experience to occur, and there's no arguing with it. There's no problem. In the same sense with thinking, the fundamental problem is, again, the belief that there's ownership over thought. There's a belief that you exist within thought. You believe you can think about yourself. If you believe those things and experience it that way, then there's this big circular relationship of a constant, never-ending string of thinking. But for example, if there's a realization that thinking occurs automatically to you, you realize that there are no objects that exist in thought. For example, is this image that you see on screen, with the picture, interpreting the image as, oh, that's something bad that might happen to me in the future. That's an interpretation. That's like eating an ice cream and saying, oh, I'm sinning. Oh, I'm gonna go to hell for this. It's like, what? It's like all that's actually occurring to your taste buds is a flavor. You're then adding other shit onto it that's not there. In the same way that when you're thinking, it's like looking at a photo. When you look at a photo of you as a baby and you start adding on things like, oh, this was the good old days back when I was young and had so many years ahead of me. It's like you're imagining something that's not there, in the sense that the way that thinking actually operates is just another sensory perception that is a fact, in the sense that I'm thinking of an image. That is the whole experience. There's not meaning to it. You're adding on meaning to it, and the way you're adding on meaning to a thought is by adding another thought onto that thought, and then adding another thought onto that thought, and that creates this never-ending cycle, because you believe that you're not experiencing thought, you're experiencing a potential future event that is actually part of reality, rather than just experiencing thinking the sensory perception. I think that's a little bit confusing, but I hope that some of that can be interpreted. So the next question that I wanted to go to, I thought was pretty interesting, because obviously if you listen to something like what I'm talking about, the first thing kind of on your mind is like, what the fuck is he talking about? Like, have I heard of this before? Is this what this person is saying? Is this other thing about that? Is this what I'm learning in my class? And unfortunately, part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this is because pretty much, I mean, there's maybe a few people out there, but it is really not talked about. And the unfortunate thing is when people think they're talking about it, they're talking about what I would say the concept is. They're not talking about the phenomena, which is really the only important part. And so this person asked the question, which I think is a good one, which is, and you can read some. These are sort of written responses I have on the subreddit. So if you want to read them in full, it might be a little bit more coherent than listening to me sort of ramble away. But this person asked, one of their questions was, this seems much related to Sam Harris's meditation app, Waking Up, where he invites the listener to look for the thing that is doing the thinking. I'm very new to his app, but it'd be interesting to see if Jamie is aware of it and hear his thoughts. So I've listened to a fair bit of Sam Harris in the past. I don't really listen to him much anymore. With regards to sort of his app and meditation and what he talks about in relationship to consciousness and meditation and these types of things, it isn't what I'm talking about. But it really seems to overlap because, again, I think the best way to describe the difference in what we're communicating is he's describing the concept, whereas I'm describing the phenomena. And I think the reason what makes it so different is I don't think that most people believe that the phenomena actually exist. For example, if you look at, say, Buddhism or Hinduism, where they talk about something like the Noble Eightfold Path, this is something that comes across as quite appealing to people because it's a little bit more like a more optimistic version of Stoicism, act according to your nature. And it can seem appealing, for example, the Noble Eightfold Path, because it's basically just like, right action, right thinking, blah, blah, blah. I mean, all of this is actually sort of a religious misunderstanding and is a little bit similar to like the 10 Commandments in the Bible. Like if you were to run with the lore, let's say, and you were to say, oh, Buddha, he was a real enlightened being, or so was Jesus. Like, let's just run with that and say it's true. What all of these religions do is, they don't say, oh, how do I know what the Buddha knows? Like, how do I have the same state as them? Or how do I experience what Jesus did? None of the religions do that. They all say, okay, well, can you just give me some tips? It's like, can you just give me some rules, basically? And what they do is the same thing that I think a lot of what Sam Harris does with, say, meditation and self-awareness, which is they talk about the concept. They never talk about the phenomena because they don't know that the phenomena exists. And so I'll just read sort of what I wrote in response to that question because, I think Sam Harris is a really intelligent guy. I don't think he's really talking about what I'm talking about or kind of gets it, if that makes any sense. But he is, and again, listen and do whatever, you feel improves your own, mental health in your own life. I'm not chastising it in any way. But I'll just read what I wrote because it's easy to kind of talk off the cuff and, misinterpret or say things you don't mean. So I wrote that I've listened to a fair bit of Sam Harris in the past, and if I were to describe what he's teaching, it's a modernized and adapted understanding of his knowledge of meditation and philosophical understanding of being/ontology. When he describes the value of meditation or inquiring to the self, he's basically describing at an advanced level the structure he's observed in his own thoughts and experience. In a sense, he has taken what he thinks he is and really mastered the understanding of that. For example, he's a big advocate of meditation because he purports or says it's a means of improving or cultivating a sense of awareness of sensory experience and an ability to remain mindful or concentrated on activity and avoiding wandering thoughts. He mentions that being aware of your anger, anxious thoughts, and being conscious of them administers a sense of ownership and reduces suffering. And so, again, that's just what I wrote. Obviously, you can't represent someone's views exactly. But say, for example, when you talk about something like mindfulness or any type of modern meditation, you really have to ask yourself the question, what are you actually doing? And, this is one of the reasons why to me it seems a little bit goofy is because, say, for example, the concept that I mentioned before, this sort of click moment I've described has historically been called self-realization. But that's such a loaded term now, and I said this last time, but it makes you sound super goofy, sort of spiritualist if you use words like that. So I don't really like the word, but that's what it is. But say in part, it's the cessation of psychological insecurity, of, sort of neurotic emotions and suffering. But I want to emphasize that it's like an instantaneous change in experience. It's not reducing your anxiety. It's not avoiding your anxiety. It's not like having a bad thought and be like, oh, I got to be mindful and I got to keep myself on track. It's not like a mental karate chop or gradual improvement like mental bodybuilding. It's just, it was there. You realize, oh my God, you may have a realization about the nature of thinking about yourself and an error that you've been making your whole life, and almost everyone does. And then that experience immediately stops permanently, because it's like untying a knot. Or I wrote in one thing, it's like peeling. It's like realizing that your phone still has the packing plastic on, and you peel it off, and you're like, oh, it's like that. And then your experience changes. It's not a gradual improvement. It's not a gradual change. Those are ultimately still forms of belief modification or self-improvement. One thing that, one of the reasons why it's really important is the original use of meditation was for self-inquiry that I introduced before. And really what it was, again, is just, basically saying, stop asking questions. You're trying to understand yourself. Stop asking me. Stop, reading books. Go sit in the corner with your eyes closed and figure out what your conscious experience is. That's what meditation is originally. And so the concept of self-realization, what becomes immediately obvious to you is you don't need to meditate because you're always meditating. It's impossible not to be in a state of meditation. For example, the concept of wandering thoughts. If you understand that thinking is an automatic sensory perception, there is no such thing as wandering thoughts. There's just what you're thinking. If you're thinking something, you're thinking it. There's no, oh, these are the good thoughts, these are the bad thoughts. The effort to compartmentalize your own conscious experience and say, well, experiencing this is called meditation, and experiencing this is not meditation. That's a distinction that you've invented by your own beliefs, and that itself is the error. The error that you can divide experience into compartments, and then, basically, you believe that you're choosing between, all these multiple paths when there's only one thing that's ever occurring. And so again, that might be a little bit of a mouthful, but I think it's worth thinking about. But to give you an example, a metaphor that's often used, let me see if I guess I'll have to do it off the top of my head because I can't see where I wrote it. But if you go look at something like Jay Krishnamurti's videos, or you listen to someone like Eckhart Tolle, who's much more spiritual, and it sort of kind of attracts people like this a bit more, is you'll see a lot of comments, say on YouTube, and the top comment will be something like, self-realization is realizing there is no self to realize. And you're like, whoa. But the misinterpretation of people saying that is usually one of, I have all these problems in my life and all this suffering, and I really wish I could just figure out the real truth, really what I'm about. Who really am I? But I've now realized there is no real me. I don't need to keep looking. I'm never going to find it. And it's like, no, that's not it. It's like you're still suffering. Your life isn't very good. You're unhappy with your own, beliefs about yourself. No, that's not what it means. If I can give the metaphor, like a lot of people sort of interpret that phrase as, oh, there's a big sign. It's like you're about to go down into a cave to find out who you really are. And they imagine that there's a sign out front, and the sign says, you don't need to go into the cave. There's nothing in there. And they're like, oh, that's what it is. It's like, no. It's the opposite. It's you're already in a cave. You've been searching in it your whole life. Come out of the cave. There's nothing there. That's what that metaphor actually means. And it's often misinterpreted. But again, it's the same thing as meditation. You use meditation as, say, a tool in the way that I described it, as just like get rid of distractions, figure yourself out. You don't need anything other than your own thinking to understand, to unravel this knot. But the moment you unravel the knot, you're like, oh my God, what the fuck was I doing? And you never need to do, then you're like, oh my, I've always been meditating. What the fuck? Oh my God, I've always been myself. What the fuck? It's a bit like that. But until that happens, you will believe there is sort of, you still need to do the inquiry. It's a little bit like that, that bell curve meme where it's like you have the idiot on the left and the the Jedi on the right, the Jedi genius with the hood on the right, and then the average person in the middle, and then the idiot and the genius both think the same thing. It's a little bit like that, where it's like the idiot on the left is just like, oh, I don't know who I am. I just do whatever. And the guy on the right is like, yeah, I don't know who I am. I just do whatever. It's like, it's a little bit of the same thing, but coming from a very different place. And, the person in the middle is just like the person who's reading all the books and doing all the spirituality and doing the mindfulness meditation and searching for, the thinker of the thoughts. And, it's sort of like overcomplicating something and ultimately trying to, get an absolutely granular view of something that is ultimately just a misunderstood and erroneous concept. But I hope that, that in some way sort of clarifies a bit. And I do want to emphasize, as for people who, I'll link Jay Krishnamurti because he was probably, I think, one of the best people to listen to on this. But again, you really have to understand that a lot of the people who talk about this have an enormous spiritual bias in the sense, not Krishnamurti, for example, but the reason why is because I think a lot of this grew out of sort of the hippie period and, there is an enormous amount of East meets West, and sort of the Eastern religious spirituality met with sort of Western hippie culture and, that type of stuff. Again, I'm not sure on the history. And so there was a lot of sort of like Enlightenment gurus. And so you have to understand the context of this was like, there was people who were like selling California, Eastern Indian yoga, retreat, and all these people did different shit. And, basically there was a lot of bullshit around it. And so a lot of these speakers, like say Jay Krishnamurti, if you listen to someone like Osho, man, are they going to say a lot of things that you're like, what? But understand that just the metaphor I gave before is what makes this so challenging is it's one of the only things, say with self-inquiry, it's one of the only things where you use thinking and you use thinking and examine your own knowledge, but you're not building a big pyramid. You're not building a big pyramid like to get a PhD or to win an award or to build a building. So you have the knowledge to go accomplish something greater or get something correct. You're actually all these people, and the same with me. You're just drawing a circle around. It's almost like a whirlpool. You're using your knowledge and using your words and your own individual perspective to try to draw a whirlpool that sort of sucks a person down, and they themselves can sort of, basically dissolve that structure. That self-knowledge dissolves itself in the whirlpool, and then that's the whole phenomenon. It's not building a big pyramid. It's something subtractive. And so, I just thought that was worth saying. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on is just, maybe bring things a bit more to a grounded, practical level. Because again, I remember when I first started looking at these types of things, the idea of a subjective inquiry, it just sounds like a person saying a lot about nothing. And you're just like, what the fuck are they talking about? But again, it's like that whirlpool. You have to do the figuring out. But I remember it being kind of like a foreign language. So maybe I thought I could kind of ground it out with one last little short segment. Where I asked, there's another question here about therapy. And I thought this would be a good point because I've said before that, therapy is a bit like pruning the leaves on a tree, while this concept is like uprooting the entire structure. But I also, understand how that might come across to people as like a bit pejorative or something where you're saying, there's no point in therapy or no point in this, which is absolutely not the case. I think it's, in a way, therapy as a means of modifying your own beliefs and behavior is something that will improve your mental health. It won't cure it if you have a sort of a, insecurity or anxiety or something. It won't cure your social anxiety, but it can improve it. And so I think that's important. So I wanted to answer this question, maybe just talk briefly about therapy and coaching, just so people sort of get an avenue of where that's coming from. So this question was, hi, one of many things that stood out to me in the recent YouTube video was the mention of therapy and what I interpreted as it's sort of beating around the bush of the actual core problem that people have. This is something I've had a vague concept of in my head for quite some time, not really feeling like therapy or even the concept of therapy actually reaches deep enough, or rather that it reaches for something that is not there or does not need to be reached for lack of better terms. I tried to make my ideas more coherent to myself and formulated that maybe therapy, along with almost everything else, reinforces and solidifies the ego just in a different way than how the issues originated. So while it may be very helpful in a lot of ways, the issue at its core still stands. The idea that was communicated in the video, the illusion that one can think about themselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, or in a podcast episode on the idea or concept of therapy the way it was brought up in the video. What the problem is, and maybe even what the alternative to the usual approach. So this is the response that I wrote, and again, I kind of thought this was good, so I'll just read it to you. I know it's kind of lame to finish off with just reading something, but I think it's appropriate. So there are lots of different types of therapy. So it depends on what the individual therapist's approach is and what the client is receptive to. I think a very loose overview of how to think about it is that coaching tries to solidify an image of yourself in the future and then help give you concrete steps to achieve that, whether practical or through reinforcing your beliefs and eliminating self-doubt. Basically, coaching reinforces your ego in the everyday use of the word and helps you live up to it. Therapy, on the other hand, usually focuses on trying to prune up your unhelpful beliefs about yourself and sort of iron out the creases. While both are not related to the phenomena I've described, they're both forms of self-improvement that modify existing beliefs to be more helpful to you rather than remove them. The irony is that, well, this is true. The irony is that the people who need coaching are the ones who most need coaching are the ones likely to go to therapy, and the people who most need therapy usually seek out coaching. Deviating from the subject a bit, but someone who is neurotic about impressing their parents and going to med school or being number one in a sport is likely to try to seek out means of achieving that in the form of coaching. But they really need therapy to modify their unsustainable and neurotic self-image. In contrast, someone who's not happy with their appearance, doesn't have any career prospects, romantic life, or friends is someone who needs coaching to improve their world, not therapy to try to cope with it. They're both misunderstandings of the necessity for psychological suffering, insecurity, and beliefs about yourself in the first place. But in summary, therapy in a broad sense tries to help you build or acquire more accurate beliefs about yourself, and coaching helps you modify behavior to help you act those beliefs out. Beliefs fundamentally being what the structure of ego, self-image, or self-knowledge is. So I wanted to end on that note, just again to kind of reel it back to a bit more of a real life basis, because people, I say things like, self-inquiry and the phenomena I'm describing is a much deeper understanding of this structure. But again, I don't want to discount from the value of coaching and therapy for people because it is something that, it helps you improve your circumstances. It's not going to resolve the underlying issues unless you, really hit something in particular. But it is something that I think is very helpful and valuable to people. So, I don't want to sort of say like, oh, you don't need those, you need this. It's like, no. In a way, these are very helpful things, but it's ultimately not going to resolve your own deeply held beliefs about yourself. But the sort of self-inquiry that I'm describing at its absolute root will do that. So I think we'll call it a day with that. I hope this has been helpful in some way. I'd love to hear any more questions people have or thoughts or opinions. Again, if you'd like to join the subreddit, you can just go to the Casually Explained subreddit, and it's linked at the top, or it's just the Staying In podcast on Reddit. And there's also Discord, and I guess I'll just link them both in the description. So thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you next time.